In the snow-choked valleys of 1871 New York, one man swore he could hold death at bay forever. Patients entered his ward alive and simply stopped leaving. No graves. No records. Only silence. What if the greatest mercy a doctor can offer is the courage to let go? The winter of 1871 did not arrive gently in Harwick Hollow. It descended like divine judgment, sharp, white, and merciless, sealing the narrow glacial valley beneath a shroud of ice that muffled every footstep and every prayer. 40 miles northeast of Albany, the hamlet clung to the earth as if afraid it might slip away entirely, a scattering of frost-blackened farms crawling up the lower slopes, rye fields frozen mid-sigh, potato cellars buried under drifts that would not melt until April. To the west rose the Helderberg Escarpment, a wall of gray stone that caught the wind and flung it back down like the voice of an angry god. To the east stood a cathedral of ancient hemlock, branches heavy with snow, whispering secrets no living ear was meant to hear. And somewhere in the county archives, now dust-choked and forgotten, lay a single leather-bound ledger that should never have survived. Its pages, written in the meticulous copperplate hand of a man who believed he could outweed eternity, recorded the names of 43 souls admitted to a ward that officially never existed. Next to 31 of those names, the column labeled discharge date remained eternally blank. Not deceased. Not transferred. Not even escaped. Just nothing. A void where a life should have ended. That ledger belonged to Dr. Elias Gault. If you had asked any soul in Harwick Hollow between 1871 and 1885 what kind of man he was, they would have answered without hesitation, a saint. A healer sent by Providence himself. The only physician who never turned a patient away, who sat through blizzards at dying bedsides, whose hands smelled of carbolic and whose eyes never betrayed exhaustion. They were half right. He was devoted obsessively, terrifyingly devoted to keeping his patients alive. But devotion, unchecked by humility, can curdle into something far darker than neglect. It can become a refusal to surrender what God has already claimed. And in that refusal, sin takes root. The way the hemlocks studied the wind. He did not drink. He attended Sunday services without fervor or complaint, sitting ramrod straight in the last pew, eyes fixed on the cross as though calculating its angles. He charged modest fees, accepted payment in potatoes or firewood when coin was scarce, and spoke in a low, precise voice that made even the most skeptical farmer feel heard. Within months, he was no longer the new doctor. He was the doctor. And then came the diphtheria. It swept down the eastern ridge like a biblical plague in the winter of 1867, choking 6 children before Gault could draw breath. Whole families watched their little ones turn blue in the lamplight, gasping for air that would not come. Gault moved like a man possessed, not by fear, but by certainty. He isolated the sick in makeshift sheds, enforced quarantine with a steel that enraged the men who needed to tend livestock. He brewed treatments drawn from obscure European journals, mixtures of nitrate of silver and steam inhalations that no American country doctor had yet dared. 3 children who should have died lived. Their parents fell to their knees in the snow outside his office, calling his name like a prayer. The Methodist minister, Reverend Elias Thorne, watched with quiet unease. A man who raises the dying, he muttered one Sunday, risks forgetting that only the Lord holds the keys to the grave. By the early 1870s the valley had swollen slightly, not with wealth, but with 24 German immigrant families drawn to the new limestone quarry on the escarpment. These men carried stone dust in their lungs like penance. Their wives carried babies through winters that cracked the earth. Their old men carried the accumulated wreckage of European factories and American hard labor. They brought with them a fierce respect for educated men who did not flinch from suffering. And they brought something else, the kind of chronic, lingering illnesses that no farm wife could manage while also feeding children and mending fences. It was for these souls, and for the poorest of the original families, that Dr. Elias Gault proposed the ward. He appeared before the town council in the winter of 1870 carrying a single sheet of paper written in that same flawless hand. The valley, he argued, needed more than house calls and hasty remedies. It needed a place of sustained, scientific vigilance, a private care home where the gravely ill could receive continuous professional attention. Not the fleeting mercy of exhausted relatives, but the steady, unblinking gaze of modern medicine. He had already chosen the building, the abandoned Renner farmhouse at the far end of the hollow, empty since the family fled to Ohio in 1868. Its owner in Albany would lease it cheaply. Gault would maintain every record, submit annual reports to the county medical officer, and operate under his own license as a private facility. No burdensome hospital regulations. Just care. One councilman, Cornelius Vander, a thick-necked farmer with eyes like winter flint, leaned forward. "And who watches the watcher, doctor? Who ensures your vigilance does not become something else?" Gault met his gaze without flinching. "The law, Mr. Vander. And my conscience. Both have served this valley well." The motion passed 3-1. By November 1871 the Renner farmhouse had been transformed. Fresh whitewash gleamed under new tin roofing. 4 iron beds stood in the main room like altars. A lean-to addition housed 2 more. Linen curtains hung crisp at the windows. The air carried the sharp, metallic scent of carbolic acid and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from a stove kept burning day and night. It smelled, the locals said, like hope. The first patient was August Breener, 47, a quarryman from Baden whose lungs had been turned to stone by years of breathing powdered limestone. His wife Marta had watched him fade for months, coughing blood into rags, unable to lift their youngest child, his breath a wet rattle that kept the whole household awake. When Gault suggested the ward, continuous monitoring, calibrated diet, proper ventilation, Marta agreed with the desperate gratitude of a woman who had already buried 2 infants to fever. She visited the following Sunday. The farmhouse was immaculate. August sat propped against pillows, breathing easier than he had in months. He squeezed her hand, smiled, told her the food was nourishing and the doctor checked on him twice daily. "I sleep through the night now, Marta," he whispered. For the first time since summer. She left reassured. She returned the next Sunday, and the one after. On the 3rd Sunday in January 1872 she found August moved to the smaller chamber off the kitchen. Gault explained gently, almost tenderly, that the main room now held a patient requiring intensive care, and August's condition had stabilized enough for the quieter space. No risk. No cause for worry. Marta noticed the new bolt on the outside of the chamber door, bright iron, freshly oiled. She said nothing. It was medical, she told herself. Sensible. For privacy. For drafts. For reasons only a trained physician could understand. But the bolt lodged in her mind like a splinter. The following Sunday a woman she had never seen before, stern, gray-haired, wearing a starched apron, answered the door and informed her that visiting hours had changed. 2 o'clock sharp. Marta had arrived early. She waited 30 minutes in the biting cold, stamping her feet, breath fogging like a soul trying to escape. When she was finally admitted, August sat in the same chair, same blanket across his knees. His voice was flat, distant, as though speaking from the bottom of a well. When she asked if he was ready to come home, he paused, a long, unnatural pause, and answered, "The doctor says it is too soon." She pressed him. What exactly had the doctor said? August's eyes drifted to the bolted door. "I cannot quite recall." Outside, walking back along the hollow road beneath a sky the color of old pewter, Marta Breener tried to name the unease coiling in her chest. It felt like guilt, but not her own. It felt like the first cold breath of something vast and unnatural stirring beneath the snow, something that had once been mercy, now twisted into a cage. And somewhere in the farmhouse behind her, Dr. Elias Gault moved silently between beds, checking pulses, adjusting pillows, murmuring to patients who no longer answered. His ledger waited open on the desk, fresh pages ready. The discharge column remained pristine. Blank. Eternal. The valley still believed he was their savior. They had not yet learned that some men do not fight death. They simply refuse to let it win. The snow that January of 1872 felt heavier than usual, as though the sky itself were pressing down on Harwick Hollow, trying to bury secrets before they could surface. Marta Breener trudged home along the hollow road, boots crunching through the crust, each step echoing the unease she could not name. Her husband August was alive. His breathing had eased. The farmhouse ward was clean, orderly, almost reverent in its whiteness. It was run by a respected physician whose name was spoken with quiet awe from the quarry to the escarpment. She had no proof of wrongdoing. Only the new iron bolt gleaming on the outside of that small chamber door. Only the unnatural pause when August searched for words that should have come easily. Only the flat, hollow tone in his voice, like an echo trapped inside a glass jar. And the chilling sensation, impossible to justify yet impossible to shake, that her husband was no longer a man being healed, but a specimen being preserved. Still. Quiet. Entirely in someone else's keeping. She did not know, as the wind clawed at her shawl and the hemlocks groaned overhead, that this had been the last real conversation she would ever have with the man she married. August Breener would remain inside the ward for 6 more long years, breathing, existing, but never truly returning to the world. Meanwhile, Harwick Hollow continued its quiet, stubborn life the way small valleys do when winter finally loosens its grip. The limestone quarry expanded, chewing deeper into the escarpment, spitting out more dust and more broken men. 3 German families bought small plots of land and began to put down roots that felt almost permanent. A second general store opened beside the mill, its shelves stocked with calico and canned goods that smelled of distant cities. The Methodist Church received a long-overdue coat of white paint that gleamed like false innocence under the spring sun. And Dr. Elias Gault's ward, still without an official name, received a slow, steady stream of patients. Some arrived after one of Gault's house calls, carried on stretchers when families could no longer manage the endless coughing, the wasting fevers, the infected wounds that refused to close. Others came through whispered referrals from neighboring towns that had begun to hear legends of the doctor who never gave up. A few desperate relatives even traveled from Albany itself, clutching letters from someone who knew someone, begging Gault to take cases that other physicians had already labeled hopeless. By 1875 the Renner farmhouse had grown. Gault added a full second story, its windows narrow and high like watchful eyes. The lean-to was enclosed into a proper wing. A single full-time nurse was hired, Theodora Kepler, a stern, efficient woman who had trained at a hospital in Utica and come to the valley to care for an aging aunt. She moved through the ward in starched aprons, her footsteps precise, her face unreadable. When villagers asked how the work suited her, she would answer in the same cool, measured tone Gault himself used, "The work is satisfying. Dr. Gault is an exceptional physician." She never smiled when she said it. Beneath the surface respect, a thin layer of unease had begun to form among the families who had loved ones inside the ward. It grew the way ice forms on a still pond in deep winter, silent, invisible, until one morning you step forward expecting water and find only cold, unforgiving hardness beneath your boot. Marta Breener was not alone in her quiet dread. Karl Fring's father, Otto, had been admitted in the spring of 1873 after a quarry accident left his lower leg savagely infected. Gault reported steady improvement in detailed, reassuring letters. Yet every time Karl asked when his father might return home, the doctor would describe yet another complication, another necessary phase of treatment, another risk of relapse that would be irresponsible to ignore. The explanations were always scientific. Always delivered in that calm, methodical voice that made doubt feel like ignorance. And Karl would always walk back down the hollow road feeling vaguely ashamed for having questioned a man of such obvious devotion. There were others. Families noticed that when a patient did die inside the ward, the very elderly, the ones whose bodies had simply worn out, Gault filed the required death certificates with the county seat in Coxsackie. But the certificates often arrived in batches, sometimes months after the actual passing. And the listed cause of death was invariably the patient's original condition: lung disease from quarry dust, septic infection from a wound, heart failure. Never anything that suggested the long stay itself might have contributed. No county medical officer ever visited the ward to inspect the premises or review the private ledgers. Rural oversight in 1870s New York was, in practice, almost non-existent. That meant Gault's intake logs, those careful copper plate entries with their haunting blank discharge column, existed only within the whitewashed walls of the farmhouse at the end of the hollow. A private kingdom of paper and pulse. In the summer of 1876, a circuit preacher named Absalom Crane passed through Harwick Hollow on his annual tour. Crane was an unremarkable man in most ways, plain face, plain coat, plain voice, but he possessed the sharp eyes of someone who had spent years watching for the hand of God in small, forgotten places. He had traveled the valley for 6 straight years. He noticed changes. He noticed that the old Renner farmhouse had grown considerably larger, sprouting new chimneys that smoked steadily even in July. He noticed that the curtains on the upper-story windows were always drawn tight, as though hiding something from both sunlight and judgment. And when he asked about the facility at the inn that evening, the innkeeper, a blunt, weathered man named Peter Schuyler, paused in a way that felt deliberate, almost wary. "It's the doctor's place," Schuyler finally said. "Gault's ward. Does good work." Crane pressed gently. "And the patients?" Schuyler looked him square in the eye, then wiped the bar with slow, deliberate strokes. "People go in." He paused. "They don't often come back out." The words hung in the warm summer air like a warning from Scripture. Crane carried that sentence with him for the rest of his circuit. When he returned to Albany that fall, he mentioned it almost casually over dinner with a colleague to a man named James Aldgate, a reporter for the Albany Evening Journal who collected strange observations the way other men collected stamps or sins. Aldgate wrote nothing at first. But he tucked the name Elias Gault, Harwick Hollow, into his memory and began, quietly and without haste, to inquire. It took James Aldgate nearly 2 years to gather enough threads to feel he was looking at something real rather than scattered village gossip. He was a careful man, scarred by past mistakes where he had confused a story with a grievance. So he moved slowly, methodically. He obtained the death certificates Gault had filed between 1871 and 1878 through the county clerk in Coxsackie. There were 11 of them. He cross-referenced them against the partial intake list he had reconstructed through painful interviews with grieving or frustrated families. The numbers were troubling. At least 28 individuals had been admitted during that period. 11 had death certificates. Of the remaining 17, there was no record, none, of any discharge. No one had come home. In the autumn of 1878, Aldgate traveled to Harwick Hollow himself. He spent 4 days at the inn, speaking with anyone willing to talk. Fewer people opened up than he had hoped. But Peter Schuyler did, always in the back room, always after checking that no one else was near. What Schuyler described was not sensational. It was worse, a mosaic of small, ordinary observations that together painted something deeply unsettling. He had seen patients in the warmer months sitting in chairs in the yard or walking slowly beside the garden that Nurse Kepler tended on the south side. Once, he had spoken with a man he recognized, Emil Vorst, a farmer from the northern end of the valley admitted 2 years earlier for a near-fatal winter illness. Vorst had clearly recovered. He walked without assistance. His speech was coherent. His color was good. Schuyler had asked him when he was going home. Vorst had looked at him with an expression Schuyler could only describe as carefully blank. "The doctor has not yet determined it is safe," he replied. Then Nurse Kepler had appeared around the corner. Vorst's eyes had slid away. The conversation died instantly. That phrase, carefully blank, lodged in Aldgate's mind like a thorn. He heard variations of it again and again. From Marta Breener, who still visited August every Sunday even though, for years after admission, her husband no longer seemed to recognize her with any consistency. From Karl Fring, who had not been allowed to see his father Otto in over a year. Gault explained that the elder Fring was in a delicate phase of treatment requiring complete rest and minimal stimulation. From Louisa Tanner, whose mother had been admitted in 1874, seemingly stable and ambulatory. 3 months later Louisa received a death certificate citing cardiac failure, yet when she had last seen her mother, the woman had been walking, talking, and showing no signs of distress. Aldgate was a journalist, not a doctor. He had covered Albany City Hospital for 2 years and knew enough about medicine to recognize when something defied ordinary explanation. Incompetence lost patients. It did not keep them indefinitely, polished and preserved like specimens in a jar. He requested an interview with Dr. Elias Gault. To his surprise, Gault agreed. They met on a cold Thursday in November 1878 in the front room of the ward. The space was exactly as everyone had described, whitewashed walls gleaming under flat gray light, scrubbed floorboards, crisp linen curtains, and that faint, clean scent of carbolic acid that somehow felt both reassuring and clinical. Gault sat across from him, hands folded neatly on his knees, dark eyes steady and unblinking. He answered every question in his calm, unhurried voice. The death certificates were accurate. The individual cases were too sensitive to discuss in detail due to patient confidentiality, a sacred professional duty. The facility's records were available to the county medical officer upon proper request. He had nothing to hide and deeply resented any implication otherwise. When Aldgate asked, as gently as possible, about patients who appeared to have recovered yet had not been discharged, Gault regarded him for a long moment. Then he spoke with quiet conviction. "Recovery is not the same as cure, Mr. Aldgate. A man who stops coughing may still be contagious. A woman whose fever breaks may relapse without warning. The premature discharge of a patient whose condition I have not fully resolved would, in my professional judgment, be a far greater cruelty than keeping them here a little longer than their families might prefer." He leaned forward slightly, the lamplight catching the precise lines of his face. "I have seen what happens when people are sent home too soon." The words hung in the orderly room like a benediction, or a threat. Outside, the wind moved through the hemlocks with a low, mournful sound, like the collective sigh of souls who had entered the ward seeking healing and found instead an eternity of careful, methodical preservation. Dr. Elias Gault was not merely keeping patients alive. He was refusing to let them go. And in that refusal, something ancient and biblical stirred, the sin of playing God, of clinging to life with a grip tighter than divine mercy itself. The valley still called him a savior. But the first cracks in that illusion had begun to show thin, sharp, and cold as the January ice that refused to melt. The air inside the Renner farmhouse that November afternoon in 1878 carried the sharp bite of carbolic acid and something subtler underneath, like the faint, metallic taste of fear carefully scrubbed away. Dr. Elias Gault sat across from James Aldgate with the posture of a man who had already won the conversation before it began. His long, immaculate fingers rested on his knees. His dark eyes held steady, unblinking, reflecting the flat gray light that filtered through the linen curtains. "I have seen them die in the beds their children still sleep in," Gault said, his voice low and measured, each word placed with surgical precision. "I have seen entire families consumed by illnesses that proper isolation would have ended in days. What I do here is not comfortable, Mr. Aldgate. But it is correct." It was a perfectly reasonable answer. Grounded in genuine medical logic. Framed in the noble language of patient welfare. The kind of response that left no easy handhold for accusation. Aldgate left the ward that cold afternoon without a single concrete violation he could point to and declare, "This is wrong." He carried only a persistent, icy feeling in his chest that he had just been skillfully managed by a man who had spent years perfecting the art. He returned to Albany and wrote the only story he could responsibly write, not an accusation, but a question. The article appeared in the Albany Evening Journal on February 14, 1879. It was careful, measured, deeply unsettling to anyone who read between its cautious lines. Aldgate did not accuse Elias Gault of any crime. He simply laid out the operations of the unnamed ward at the end of Harwick Hollow, the growing concerns of families, the troubling gap between admissions and recorded discharges. He posed a series of pointed questions, nominally addressed to the county medical board, about the oversight of private care facilities in rural New York. No patient names. No specific allegations. Every claim supported by documented fact. It was, in every legal and journalistic sense, exemplary cautious reporting. In Harwick Hollow, it was received as a declaration of war. Supporters of Dr. Gault, many of them, for he had practiced in the valley for 13 years and had genuinely pulled souls back from the brink, were furious. The town council convened an emergency meeting. Cornelius Vander, now older and somewhat mellowed toward the doctor, moved that they send a formal letter to the journal expressing complete confidence in Gault's character and the ward's operations. The motion passed unanimously. The following Sunday, Reverend Elias Thorne preached a fiery sermon on the sin of slander, his voice echoing off the freshly painted clapboard walls. 3 of the German families whose relatives were not patients circulated a petition signed by 42 residents vouching for Gault's professional excellence. Marta Briner did not sign it. Neither did Karl Fring. A handful of others, quieter, less willing to invite attention, also refused, and in the weeks that followed they felt the subtle weight of social pressure. Not outright ostracism, but something close enough, invitations that stopped coming, greetings that grew cooler, eyes that slid away in the general store. The valley had chosen its savior. Those who questioned him became an uncomfortable presence in a community that had organized its very survival around his competence for over a decade. But Aldgate's article had also reached Albany. It landed on the desk of the State Medical Board's administrative secretary, a meticulous man named Horace Delacroix. Delacroix took his obligations seriously. He wrote a polite, routine letter to Dr. Gault requesting a formal submission of patient records for the preceding 5 years. The letter arrived at the house on Fellow Creek Road in the third week of February 1879. What happened next is known only through fragments. A farmhand named Silas Pruitt, who sometimes made deliveries along the Hollow Road, later told Aldgate that on the night of February 23 he had seen an unusual amount of smoke pouring from the chimney of the ward's new stone outbuilding, the one added in 1876 that served as storage for records and supplies. More smoke, Pruitt said, than any ordinary heating fire would produce. It was the thick, acrid smoke that comes from burning paper. 3 weeks later, Gault submitted to the State Medical Board a set of records covering only 1876 through 1879. 19 admissions. 19 corresponding discharges or death certificates. The documents were clean, legible, internally consistent. Delacroix reviewed them, found no immediate irregularities, and filed them away. For the moment, the official inquiry stalled. But something far more dangerous had begun among the families. The article had cracked their isolation. Each household had been carrying its private uncertainty, its carefully reasonable explanations, its guilty reluctance to seem ungrateful to the man who had, after all, kept their loved one breathing. Now they saw they were not alone. Other people were asking the same questions. The questions themselves were not unreasonable. Marta Breener wrote a letter to James Aldgate. So did Karl Fring. So, eventually, did Hedwig Rausch, whose brother Conrad had been admitted in 1874. In 1877 Gault had informed her by post that Conrad's condition had deteriorated beyond the point where visits could be permitted. Conrad Rausch would have been 41 years old in 1879. No death certificate for him had ever been filed. In the spring of 1879, Aldgate returned to Harwick Hollow with the letters tucked in his coat and a far clearer sense of the darkness he was circling. This time he did not request an interview with Gault. He went directly to the ward and asked to see the patients. Nurse Theodora Kepler met him at the door. Polite. Immovable. The ward was not open for unannounced visits. The doctor was not in. She would convey his request. Aldgate asked specifically to see August Breener. Kepler's expression remained smooth. Mr. Breener's care requirements do not permit unannounced visits. He asked to see Conrad Rausch. Something shifted behind Kepler's eyes, subtle, but Aldgate noticed and filed it away like evidence. I am not aware of a patient by that name, she said. Aldgate pressed. Conrad Rausch had been admitted in July 1874 and had never been reported discharged or deceased. Kepler replied with perfect composure that she could not discuss individual patient cases. Then she closed the door. Standing on the worn wooden steps in the mild April sunlight, listening to the heavy iron bolt slide into place on the other side, James Aldgate felt cold clarity wash over him like creek water in spring thaw. This was no longer a story about medical negligence. He was looking at something deliberate. Something calculated. Something that felt like a violation of the natural order itself, a man who had decided that death was an enemy he would never allow to claim what he had claimed for himself. The investigation that followed was neither swift nor clean. It did not deliver a single dramatic revelation that would satisfy a simple tale of justice. Instead, it built through a slow, grinding accumulation of legal, medical, and journalistic pressure that gradually made Elias Gault's position untenable. It began with Marta Breener. In May 1879 she retained a young lawyer in Coxsackie named Theo Hollis. Hollis had read Aldgate's article and agreed to take the case at a reduced fee. He filed a formal petition to the county court seeking access to August Breener and the right, as his wife, to participate in decisions about his care. The petition was straightforward. The county judge, Orville Strang, a cautious man well aware of Gault's standing in the community, was nevertheless forced to sign the order in June. He could find no legal basis to refuse it. Gault's response, delivered through his Albany lawyer, was clinical and devastating. He portrayed August Briner as suffering from severe mental deterioration, a lingering consequence of the original lung disease's impact on neurological function. He submitted a detailed medical report in his own precise hand describing a man no longer capable of self-directed action or coherent communication, who required continuous institutional care for his own safety and the safety of others. He argued that Marta's visits were not helpful but actively harmful, causing distress that set back treatment. Judge Strang, reluctant to create unnecessary controversy, appointed a neutral physician from Albany, Dr. Francis Cleary, to evaluate August Briner and report directly to the court. Cleary arrived at the ward on a Tuesday morning in August 1879, accompanied by a county constable. Gault had not been informed of the escort, and Kepler, meeting them at the door, had no legal grounds to turn them away. Gault himself was absent, tending patients at his office on Fellow Creek Road. Kepler led them through the ward with the rehearsed composure of someone who had prepared for this moment many times. In the main room, Cleary found 3 elderly patients in beds, all in states of apparent sedation. He noted the faint, sweetish smell he associated with laudanum, the tincture of opium that was legal, widely available, and often misused in those years. He observed muscle tone suggesting long-term immobility. One woman, unidentified because no names were displayed on the beds, showed pressure sores consistent with months, perhaps years, of being confined. He asked to see the remaining patients. Kepler replied that the other rooms were in use and could not be disturbed. The constable reminded her that the court order covered the entire facility. Kepler hesitated, then said she would need to consult Dr. Gault. The constable stepped past her into the hallway. That is not an option currently available to you. The second and third rooms held 2 patients each, in similar conditions, sedated, immobile, breathing slowly under the watchful eyes of the ward. The small chamber off the kitchen, the one with the iron bolt on the outside, held a single patient. Cleary estimated the man's age at approximately 50, which matched August Briner in 1879. He sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the summer light with the slow, unfocused attention of someone who had lived in a chemically softened world for a very long time. Cleary asked his name. After a long pause, the man answered, August. Cleary asked what month it was. August looked out at the bright green world beyond the glass, then back at the doctor. I don't know. Cleary asked the final question, his voice gentle but firm. Do you want to go home? August Briner was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the soft creak of the wooden chair and the distant call of a crow from the hemlock forest. His eyes, once sharp with the pride of a quarryman, now drifted across the room as though searching for a memory that had been carefully, methodically erased. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin, distant, like an echo from the bottom of a deep well. I don't remember what home feels like anymore. Outside, the summer wind moved through the leaves with a sound almost like morning. Inside the whitewashed walls of the ward, Dr. Elias Gault's vision of perfect, unending care continued its quiet, relentless work, keeping bodies alive long after souls had begun to slip away. But the walls were beginning to crack. And the God who gives life and appoints its end was watching. Then August Briner spoke again, slowly, each word dragged up from some deep, fog-bound place inside him, as if speech itself had become a foreign language. I don't think the doctor wants me to. 6 simple words. Spoken by a man who, by every physical measure, had long since recovered from the quarry dust that once ravaged his lungs. A man who had entered the ward 8 years earlier gasping for breath and now sat breathing easily in summer sunlight. Those 6 words became the cold, undeniable center of Dr. Francis Cleary's report to the county court. Cleary wrote with clinical detachment, yet the horror bled through every line. August Briner showed no active disease requiring institutional confinement. His cognitive fog and emotional flatness appeared consistent with prolonged administration of sedative compounds, laudanum and similar tinctures, rather than any irreversible neurological damage from his original illness. In Cleary's professional opinion, August's continued retention in the ward was medically unwarranted. Utterly so. Worse still, Cleary noted that the majority of patients in the ward appeared, by all physical evidence, to have recovered from their presenting conditions. They were not dying. They were being deliberately maintained in a state of pharmacological compliance, kept docile, dependent, and silent, preventing them from expressing any desire to leave, or even remembering that a life outside those whitewashed walls still existed. The report landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread. In October 1879, Elias Gault was summoned before the State Medical Board in Albany. He arrived impeccably prepared, thick folders of records, citations from European medical texts, and a calm, methodical defense of every protocol he had employed. He argued that Cleary was merely a general practitioner, unqualified to judge the complexities of long-term chronic care. The medications were standard, even merciful, for patients whose conditions demanded absolute control. Martha Breener's petition, he claimed, stemmed from understandable but misguided emotion, dangerously amplified by reckless journalism. He was persuasive. He had always been persuasive. The board in 1879 lacked the tools, the precedent, or the political will to act decisively on what they possessed, a pattern of deeply suspicious evidence rather than one clear, prosecutable crime. So they watched. And in the watching, more truths clawed their way into the light. Hedwig Rausch, with the help of lawyer Theo Hollis, demanded a formal accounting of her brother Conrad. In December 1879, Gault finally filed a death certificate claiming Conrad had died of pneumonia in September of the previous year. Hedwig petitioned for burial records. The small cemetery along the Hollow Road held no grave for Conrad Rausch. Gault explained, with perfect composure, that Conrad had been interred on the ward's own property, which he now legally owned, at the family's request. Hedwig swore under oath that no such request had ever been made. No family member had even been informed of the death until 15 months after it supposedly occurred. In the spring of 1880, investigators found a small, enclosed plot on the north side of the Renner farmhouse. The earth there had been disturbed. Beneath modest wooden markers lay the remains of at least 4 individuals. Painstaking work matched 3 of them to intake records: Conrad Rausch, a quarry worker named Philip Ostern, and a woman from a neighboring valley whose family had been told years earlier that she had been discharged in 1875. The 4th body was never identified. Gault maintained through every hearing, every deposition, that the burials had been conducted with full family knowledge and consent. The deaths, he insisted, were from natural causes entirely consistent with the patient's conditions. Any delay in filing paperwork was a mere administrative oversight, not concealment. He was asked, again and again, in multiple legal forums, to explain the infamous blank discharge column in his ledgers. He offered variations of the same answer: it was an old clerical system he had since revised. An artifact of his personal record-keeping method. It meant nothing. The board could not prove, beyond all doubt, that the blanks meant something definitive. But they could, and eventually did, determine that his pattern of administering sedative compounds without clear medical justification, his repeated failure to maintain proper death records, and his systematic obstruction of legitimate family access to patients constituted sufficient grounds for action. In the spring of 1885, after years of quiet pressure, the State Medical Board convened a closed administrative hearing. There was no public trial. No jury. Only a formal agreement. Elias Gault signed a document surrendering his medical license in the state of New York immediately and permanently. He would never practice medicine there again. He left Harwick Hollow that same spring, slipping away like smoke from the outbuilding chimney on that February night years earlier. Rumors followed him west, sightings in Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then further still, always in quiet counties where his name had not yet arrived ahead of him. Whether he continued his work in new shadows, no one could say with certainty. The ward was emptied, its 6 remaining patients, including August Breener, were returned to their families or, in 2 cases where no family claimed them, transferred to the county almshouse. The once pristine farmhouse stood silent, its iron bolts now useless, its windows staring blankly at the hemlock forest. August Breener came home to Marta in April 1885. He had spent 13 years inside the ward. He was 60 years old. He walked with the hesitant, shuffling gait of a man relearning how to move through open space. Large stretches of his memory, roughly from 1875 to 1885, had been erased, replaced by a gray absence interrupted only by fleeting impressions, the rectangle of a window, the creak of a wooden chair, the sharp smell of carbolic acid mixed with the cloying sweetness of laudanum, the soft rhythm of Nurse Kepler's footsteps in the hallway. He lived 4 more years. In the fall of 1889, he died quietly in his own bed with Marta beside him, holding the hand that had once gripped hers with the strength of a quarryman. The county physician listed the cause as heart failure. It was accurate. The heart, after all, can only endure so much stolen time. James Aldgate spent the final years of his career haunted by a single, terrible question: not whether Elias Gault had done something wrong. The evidence, though never enough for criminal court, was more than enough for conscience, but why? Not the abstract what was wrong with the man, but the mechanical, specific why of his own stated philosophy. Because Gault had explained himself on multiple occasions, not as confession, but as defense. The prolonged use of sedatives was a legitimate tool for managing difficult cases. Extended stays were the necessary price of taking recovery seriously, of refusing to discharge a patient until he was completely certain there would be no relapse, no spread of disease, no return in worse condition. Families, he argued, were too emotional, too impatient, too ignorant of medical reality to appreciate the depth of care he provided. Aldgate came to believe that this was not entirely a lie. Somewhere inside the clean, orderly system Gault had constructed at the end of the hollow lay a genuine, fanatical conviction that if he could control every variable, if he could isolate patients from the chaos of ordinary life, from their own unpredictable choices, from the natural intrusions of family and world, he could achieve outcomes that lesser medicine could never touch. In Gault's framework, keeping patients alive too long was not a perversion of care. It was its purest, most elevated expression. What made him dangerous was not indifference. It was love without limits. Care without surrender. A devotion so absolute that it left no room for the patient's autonomy, their relationships, their right to experience the full measure of their own existence. They were no longer people to be returned to their lives. They were cases to be perfected. Specimens to be preserved in a state of managed stability. The institution he built, whitewashed, meticulously documented, wrapped in the unassailable authority of science and professionalism, was perfectly engineered to silence any challenge until the damage was irreversible. Theodora Kepler left Harwick Hollow the same week as Gault. Investigators determined she had merely followed physicians' orders and could not be held criminally accountable. Whether she had ever recognized the wrongness of what she enabled, whether she had buried that knowledge beneath duty or rationalized it away, no one ever knew. She vanished into another life, another name perhaps, leaving no further trace. The Renner farmhouse stood empty for years, then became a summer residence for a family from Albany who knew nothing of its past. Over decades it was renovated, expanded, and eventually allowed to fall back into the earth, its original structure swallowed by time and forest until it became indistinguishable from the landscape itself. The intake ledgers survived, misfiled, mislabeled, gathering dust in county storage for nearly a century. 43 names. 31 blank discharge dates. When a local historical society finally examined them in the late 20th century, the archivist noted in her report the unervingly clean handwriting in the discharge column. No corrections. No hesitation. Whoever kept those records had always intended, from the very first entry, to leave those spaces empty. She did not know what to make of it. She wrote it down accurately and moved on to the next box. Some truths are not revealed in thunder. They emerge through the slow, patient accumulation of things that refuse to be explained away: the iron bolt on the outside of a door, the unnatural smoke rising on a winter night, the carefully blank columns, and the quiet voice of a man who had been kept alive, methodically, professionally, mercilessly, for years past any medical need, sitting in a chair by a sunlit window, saying with heartbreaking resignation, "I don't think the doctor wants me to." This is the macabre legacy of Elias Gault. A story that warns us about the seductive danger of unchecked authority wrapped in the robes of expertise. How an institution built on genuine care can still become a cage. How a man can dedicate his entire life to a principle, saving life at all costs, and twist that principle into justification for sins that should never be permitted in the sight of God or man. Because in the end, the greatest cruelty is not death. It is refusing to let a soul meet its appointed end. What do you think happened to Dr. Elias Gault after he disappeared west? Did he stop, or did he simply find new patients and new shadows? Do you believe every secret of the ward was ever truly uncovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. These are the stories history tries to bury, but they never truly stay silent. If this journey into darkness moved you, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who dares to look closer at the past. More forgotten horrors await. Until next time, may mercy always know when to let go.